At some point, you might have heard the catchphrase, real communism has never been tried. This is a facetious line of thinking, and we'll explain why. In Marxism, communism is an end goal, an ideal of what society should look like after a certain vision is realized. A body politic that hasn't gotten there but is rather a work in progress in that direction is called a socialist system. Under the breath, real communism has never been tried is more so saying real communism has never been achieved. And among leftists, it's common to throw this around to fish detractors on a technicality. A socialist society has never achieved communism is a statement most people won't formulate, and it only obfuscates this particular conversation for the sake of a gotcha moment. The fact people don't want to take the question on its terms, looking critically at why many socialist experiments didn't or haven't met their end goals, has turned into a meme. What is funny in its own special way is that the political right that laughs at this believes its own version of the same thing. Right libertarians, at least the fans of the Austrian School of Economics, use a theory called praxeology. In this context, praxeology proposes that there is a knowable set of principles that guide human actions. This idea is not wholly illegitimate. First principles are at the heart of how theoretical mathematics is done, and when explored by people in an academic environment, it can generate some interesting ways to think about how we interact with each other. There have been Nobel Prize winners in economics who were praxeologists, and though they're now a sort of sick man of econ, people who call themselves Austrian come forward every season with interesting concepts and ideas. There are, however, lower resolution versions of their thoughts, and they're more popular than one might think. Have you ever encountered someone who says that a public healthcare system is communism, or that the homeless just need to get a job? Or that what's wrong with society is that regulations are preventing business from doing business and that ruins everything somehow. That's what the talk's about. The idea that capitalism is human nature and that obstructing capitalism is like obstructing nature is one of those low-resolution axioms. You would never hear that in an academic setting where axioms are highly context and utility dependent. But you will hear it constantly in politics. It's such a widespread myth that if you poke around it, it might feel to others, or even to you, as outside the rules, like kicking a basketball. A way to test if an axiom is good is quite simple. It should sound like stating something self-evident. Something like apples and oranges is the same as oranges and apples. And I ask sincerely, do you think there is any economic principle that holds that firm? No exceptions. I have my doubts. New fields like behavioral economics are more interested in the emotional and the organic. They're increasingly poking holes in classical models. Being largely psychological, rules here are more descriptive than prescriptive, which is why instead of arguments that primarily rely on statements of principle, we use statistics. Ludwig von Mises, however, one of the most notorious Austrian economists, believed you could find these secure statements. He was so convinced of axioms that he thought contrasting theory against events was foolish. If something seemed to be the wrong conclusion, it was because the first principles weren't being looked at correctly. Rather than looking and burning through precedents and documents, evidence, you could say, as we do now, praxeologists propose that you can arrive at objective truths about human behavior simply by deductive reasoning, exploring the implications of certain axioms. You won't be surprised to hear that one of the main criticisms of Austrian economics is that their theories are untestable, to that extent unfalsifiable, and to that extent unscientific. In the words of John Maynard Keynes, who admittedly isn't the most beloved guy by right libertarians,
practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist.
The West has a market economy, the most prosperous and diverse there has been in history. And yet there's a sense of dissatisfaction by right libertarians about all the restraints they perceive the market to have. This thought process almost invites the question, has real capitalism been tried yet? Well, what we intend to do here is to run a stress test of these first principles. The idea that business, if left to its means, can bring freedom and prosperity for all. And we're going to the West Bank to do it. Markets as we understand them are created by states. Money didn't exist for most of human history. Hunter-gatherer economies organized by very diverse and complex systems of gift-giving and bartering. Though voluntary exchange was involved, which is the most bare-bones definition of a market, modern finance as a discipline was so inconceivable to people and rulers that we could dispense with the concept altogether when trying to see the world from their perspective. The first people to issue something resembling money were ancient empires, who gave out fares like vouchers or beer to workers. These weren't universally transferable tokens, they were exchanged for goods from a government silo. Over thousands of years, these evolved into currency. The acceptability of a currency, however, was tied to the outreach of these empires' economies of scale. If you're not trading in Egypt, the pharaoh's minted coin that's worth one sack of grain has no value beyond that of the coin itself. Similarly, if you were dropped in the Sahara with $1 million, you could buy your way out several times, but without an entity to back the value of your money, you're stuck. That is because the reach of the state continues to be the thing that lets a market, as we understand it, exist. States enforce contracts, protect people in the market, and issue bonds, basic services, and taxes. Most serious economists and politicians, even when extremely libertarian, don't want to abolish the state, but rather shrink it so that it can perform at least some basic functions, and one of the main ones is monetary policy. Historically though, governments acquire functions rather than losing them. In general, the more a state develops, its ability to exercise power increases, and one of the main areas of importance is the ability to regulate the market. To land on the topic, it bears to say that states can benefit from injustices, and such a state, in charge of a well-integrated government apparatus, can regulate the market in such a way that said injustices are cemented and built into the functioning of the economy itself. Shareholders are concerned with security and profits, and if those can be delivered by a repressive state, well, if you reason on the profit margins, if you only think as a rational investor, you're set. These tribes are very strong and omnipresent. You can choose as a business to stick to your values, but you'll always be competing against everyone who doesn't, and over many iterations, that competitive advantage tends to win and reflect in the economy. Nevertheless, progressive capitalism and the woke brand, whatever those may be, want to suggest the contrary. Behind concepts like corporate social responsibility is the idea that businesses have the ability to self-regulate in the interest of a community's well-being. More radically, that philanthropy and charity could even be possible substitutes for taxation in both effect and morality. Global warming, anti-bullying, you name it. The framework that for many is an axiom says that letting charitable tycoons donate to causes they care about is an effective way to build better societies, which invites an obvious question: is it true? One can take many positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but rather than add another dissection to the thousands of them you can find just on YouTube, we'll take a look at an attempt to resolution. Capitalism as the argument for peace. First of all, it is undeniable that the government of Israel systemically oppresses Palestinians today. Many reputable organizations have described settlements as an occupation and the treatment of Palestinians as apartheid. We agree with that, but this does not mean Israel shouldn't exist or anything of that sort. The historic ties of Jews to the Levant is older than all American nations, or most nations founded on colonialism for that matter. So if they're illegitimate, just by age, so would be a lot of states, founded on gruesome displacements and supremacy that continue to this day. However, Israel's particular type of oppression is playing out in living memory. Despite condemnations by the US, the country's biggest ally, Israel is engaging in a slow, tactical seizure of lots within the West Bank. These sometimes look like purchases, evictions, or spontaneous spikes of construction in empty mountains. 3,000 new homes were approved for construction by the end of 2021. Whereas the Arab population of Palestine started at a baseline and has oscillated between high growth and negative growth since the 50s, accounting for displacements such as the Nakba and the Naksa, the Jewish population of Israel has almost always had positive growth above the world average. sometimes very high growth, as in the 90s rates were as high as 6%. Today, it has twice the average birth rate of the OECD, along with one of the easiest routes to immigration and accommodation through the right of return for Jews, something that Palestinians don't have. Around 30 years ago, Israel had half the population of Greece, and it's projected to overtake it somewhere this decade. Many of the settlements in the West Bank are built with this in mind. The challenge for Israel is to host people in a region that is mostly desert and where the few spots suitable for human habitation are increasingly dense. The West Bank and Gaza, which are the centers managed by the Palestinian authorities, are twice as dense as Japan. Israel is about as dense as Japan, but this number doesn't tell the whole story, as about 60% of the country, at least under the 1949 borders, is a Negev, an area so dry and desolate that it has mostly been a buffer strategic territory inhabited by caravans and nomads since the times of Rome. As you might imagine, almost no one lives here. Just so you get an idea of how strict and delicate space management is here, the dead are buried standing up, not so much on the ground, but increasingly in cemetery towers. As the de facto authority of the region, Israel has developed a rise and kill first attitude, a geopolitical strategy based around navigating historically hostile neighbors and organizations. The country has had right-wing governments since the turn of the millennium who are less inclined to coexistence as much as self-preservation. This has played out in targeted assassinations, war, and also violence against Palestinian civilians. Palestinians in turn resent the actions of Israel, and they have engaged in a series of resistance attempts since the formation of the state, sometimes too with violence against Israeli civilians. The arguments for legitimacy and control over the territory are stacked in conflicting claims, going back to events in ancient history and reinforced by events in modern history by two historically oppressed peoples. But if one thing can be asserted out of all this, it's that it's terrible for business. But you know what's not terrible for business? Having a secure internet connection. Online, there are lots of malicious agents fishing for your information. There are various traps trying to get your passwords or location, and all it takes is a misclick to unleash them on your computer. With AtlasVPN, you can protect all your devices with a single subscription. A VPN can also allow you to find the best offers in online shopping sites and browse for media that is not available near you. For example, I use AtlasVPN to find online national libraries, which makes research for my videos a lot faster. If you're less of a nerd, you can always watch Netflix shows exclusive to other countries. That's not all. For a limited time, you can steal yourself the Black Friday deal. You'll get AtlasVPN Premium for just $1.70 a month, and 6 months extra completely free. This is the best AtlasVPN offer of the year, so get it fast by clicking the link in the description. If you're not wholly convinced, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, but I believe that once you learn all you can do with a VPN, you won't feel the need to. It will really change your internet browsing experience. And if you want to learn about different experiences, well, what are the challenges for business in Israel or Palestine? Ultimately, because of this political landscape, Israel is a constant target of international boycotts. Organizations such as BDS will make it very easy for someone to consult companies not to consume from if they're considered to support the occupation. There exist various Israel-affiliated corporations that people refuse to purchase from, which is a liability to these businesses. Many international firms are also somewhat reluctant to franchise themselves in a territory where major cities are the target of missiles every year. The conflict also severely limits Palestine's ability to conduct economic growth. The state of Palestine isn't recognized by Canada, Mexico, the US, France, Italy, Germany, Britain, Spain, Japan, and South Korea. There are more in this list, but these countries alone account for over 50% of the world's GDP and a significant share of humanity's service sector. Just try to imagine your life without products from any of these countries, and then realize that the lived reality for Palestine is that it cannot conduct direct trade with any of them, at least as of the making of this video. The conflict means violence, dispossession, and the end of many human lives on both sides of the issue. And from an economic angle, it also brings capital insecurity and missed opportunities for development. It would stand to reason that business, thinking solely from the interests of business, would want peace. After all, peace would mean access to more foreign and domestic markets, more chances for cooperation, and a larger economically active population. Have you ever heard this idea that diversity is good for the workplace? Well, the way that works is that ventures which have anti-racist or even just not racist hiring practices have proved to be more productive and competitive. The simple reason is that they have access to a greater pool of human capital. I want to stress that none of these are leftist talking points. Milton Friedman made some version of this argument in the 70s. Friedman's reasoning was that businesses with discriminatory hiring practices pay a cost for restricting their access to talent. In this view, the best punishment for a racist employer is that racism will make the firm less competitive, and thus more likely to fail. There's a cost to being a racist. This is basically the problem for both Israel and Palestine, taken to the level of a state. Not having a resolution comes with a massive cost in opportunities. Neither can benefit from the other, which has been incredibly limiting for the private sector. Business leaders in turn tried to organize to bring an end to the conflict. In 2012, a pressure group called Breaking the Impasse was formed to make exactly this argument: end the conflict and let us bring prosperity to all. It was supported by some of the richest people in both Israel and Palestine, such as the tech mogul Yossi Vardi and the wealthiest man in Palestine, Munib al-Masri. Even John Kerry sponsored the idea as chair of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. At the time, Kerry was at the peak of his career as a backer of the Paris Accords and the Iran nuclear deal. However, this initiative fell apart after the 2014 Gaza war, pushed by political forces that overwhelmed the organizers. The end result being that the power of the state overwhelmed the power of the market, as it tends to be. So, should we say that business isn't capable of reaching the barriers of politics and making peace possible? Could it maybe improve the lives of Palestinians under the occupation? Well, let's take a look.
The Palestinian situation under Israeli occupation and apartheid is a pressing issue in the minds of Palestinian officials and capitalists. Capital has always played a major role in this struggle for freedom, even during the heyday of the PLO, where Gulf funding was a major resource. However, things have slightly changed in this day and age. Capital flow to Palestine is no longer done at the whims of geopolitical interests, but as a part of a broader effort at neoliberalization of the Palestinian economy. This process of neoliberalization was something that the Palestinian Authority brought into Palestine themselves. It began when the Palestinian Authority began, during the Oslo process, which began in 1993. Something which many people seem not to understand about this process was that it was meant to be temporary. The Authority was an interim government that was only supposed to exist for 5 years, a time under which the negotiators were supposed to arrive at some sort of resolution of the conflict. Though there was a lot of doubt on whether this process would actually work, there was also a fair amount of excitement in the prospect of Palestinians planning and running their own state, a state with its own economy and jurisdiction. The first of these proposals came in 1998. They assumed that by 2005 we would see a Palestinian state, with borders opened to neighboring countries and the return of Palestinian refugees. The plans were focused on dealing with an issue that weighed down upon Palestinian urban planning for centuries, that being that the people that actually lived there had no control over the planning of their own cities. Their vision for the future would be to see resources directed to expanding existing municipalities and building them up. However, the plan was not adopted, and the dreams of the Oslo technocrats would not be recognized. The dream that would be realized would be that of one former IMF official, Salam Fayyad. Salam Fayyad was a man whose entire career was defined by banking and international finance. Fayyad would soon go on to become the Minister of Finance under Yasser Arafat in 2002. His career was symbolic of the creep of neoliberalization of the Palestinian economy, and soon his efforts and efforts like his would bear fruits. In 2003, the new Palestinian Constitution was formed. Among a bunch of other promises that it never kept was an article declaring a constitutional right to a free market, protection of private property, and free economic activity. an Ayn Rand-like policy smack dab in this constitution. Things continued along this path throughout the 2000s, and would culminate in the appointment of Salam Fayyad to Prime Minister in 2007 under Mahmoud Abbas. Fayyad's appointment was done at the behest of international donors and signaled the end of the financial boycott of the PA imposed after the election of Hamas. Fayyad was here to save the Palestinian economy, and there is evidence that his appointment made some difference. The increase in funding from the end of the boycott and the flowing of aid allowed for more domestic spending. From 2008 to 2009, the PA created 6 to 7% growth. Fayyad adopted a policy of bottom-up growth, where the government would only handle low-cost yet vital projects based on people's needs. For areas where the PA lacked the capacity to act, they invited the free market to handle the bigger projects. It is likely due to the Fayyad reforms and others that led to Palestine going up 26 places in the Ease of Doing Business ranking in 2018. This is what Thomas Friedman affectionately called Fayyadism, and the feeling of which could be best felt in the speech Fayyad gave to investors in 2008. The time has come to invest in Palestine. The international community showed its overwhelming support of the Palestinian economy in Paris last December, and PIC Palestine intend to continue this process of creating an environment conducive to investment-led growth. While the conference is private sector run, the Palestinian National Authority offers its full support and is working to make the conference a success. We are throwing a party, and the whole world is invited. This conference is a chance to show a different face of Palestine, a Palestine conducive to economic growth and international investment. I welcome you to Palestine for a chance to enjoy our hospitality and to learn firsthand that you can do business in Palestine. The political and economic context which we just discussed gave birth to an idea formulating in the mind of one man with a lot of money and a lot to prove. Bashar al-Masri is a Palestinian entrepreneur. In 1993, he came to Palestine as an engineer in order to get into manufacturing, but realized that anything he assembled could end up being disassembled at an Israeli checkpoint. Instead, he decided to focus on real estate. Beatty Real Estate Investment Company was founded in December 2007. The property he is developing is called Rawabi, meaning hills in Arabic. It is 6,300 dunams, or 1,557 acres in size. It is meant to house 40,000 people of the middle class. It is located north of Ramallah in the West Bank, primarily in Area A and partly in Area B. It is surrounded by the Palestinian villages of Ajul, Atara, and Abwain. Most notably, 0.621371 miles away in Area C lies the Israeli settlement of Ataret. Just from this description, you can kind of get a clue as to how Rawabi is being presented to the public. Basically, it is sending a message that in a land where housing and living space is subject to the whims of a foreign occupation, Palestinians can still determine the fate of housing. It's presented as if it is a way of freeing Palestine. In addition, Rawabi is a very modern and wealthy city with millions of dollars being pumped into the project. This imagery of Palestinian wealth is extremely appealing to a population where most people are relatively poor. The broader push of Fayyadism and its manifestation in Rawabi is to use capitalism as a form of state building. People like Bashar al-Masri seek to be the vanguard towards a new free Palestine firmly under the influence of capital. When the government is corrupt and when the Israelis are placing barriers to growth, this sort of neoliberal nationalism is very appealing to many Palestinians, but it also has some critiques which we will get into later. Masri is presented as a guy who can get stuff done that even the government can't do. And in practice, this is partly true. For example, the barriers presented from the Israeli occupation have in part been circumvented by Rawabi. The Rawabi planners promised they would create a road connected to a highway leading directly to Ramallah. This highway went through Area C, which was under Israeli control. Before this, in order to get to Rawabi, from Rawabi, you had to pass through checkpoints, which bottlenecked traffic and made the process an irritating drag. However, with all the money invested into Rawabi, the pressure eventually became too much for Israel to bear, resulting in them allowing the road to be built. The Berzit checkpoint had historically been used to prevent students from reaching Berzit University. And in the grand scheme of Israeli domination of the West Bank, this is a shocking, albeit minor, victory for the Palestinians. These kinds of feats feed into the admittedly self-promulgated mythos of Bashar al-Masri as this great man of history here to save Palestinians from the occupation. As a former employee of Masri puts it, he doesn't care about areas A, B, and C. He wants a road, he will get it. Even the Palestinian Authority, which routinely brutalizes its citizenry, has bent to the will of Masri. The Palestinian Authority has created the Rawabi bylaw in order to create a municipality run by the Rawabi developers. Land within that municipality is thus used under the prerogative of Masri. Usually when land is purchased and things are built in the West Bank, it is based on need and in line with the local authorities and relevant laws. However, for projects such as Rawabi, housing is created based on speculation from investors and laws are changed in favor of the project. Essentially, Masri skipped a very long bureaucratic line in order to have this project built. Despite the ways in which Rawabi bends the politics of the West Bank around him, this project is somehow conceived of as apolitical. Investors from Qatar, America, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Israelis, and US aid have all come together to invest, work on, and promote this project. The miracle of business is that it can heavily involve itself in politics while somehow avoiding the aesthetics of politics. Despite the many criticisms that you can levy towards Rawabi concerning how well it actually is serving the Palestinian cause, it nonetheless has received some backlash from reactionaries in Israel. For example, in 2010, the Israeli Minister of Environmental Protection, Gilad Erdan, famous for telling Arabs to go back to Syria and for proposing bills aimed at Arab disloyalty to Israel, was invited by Masri to visit his building site. Erdan, after leaving the site, made sure to inform the public that Rawabi must be stopped. The backlash became more unhinged as people went so far as to create a website called rawabi.co.il to fool people Googling for rawabi.ps. Unlike the PS website, which is actually run by the Rawabi company, the Israeli website had a blood-red background, chided Israel for failing to stop Rawabi from being built, and accused Palestinians of potentially using Rawabi as a site to launch rockets. Naturally, settlers are also very upset at the idea of Rawabi, seeing themselves as the true victims here. They posit that it is unfair that a site like Rawabi can be built, but they are not allowed to commit a war crime settling in the West Bank. This manifested in settler activists using the argument that Israel is discriminating against them for giving concessions to Rawabi taking action. Beyond just making inflammatory websites, they have attempted to create an outpost near Birzeit in order to create a sequence of Jewish presence, just as Rawabi had created a sequence of Palestinian presence. These settlers protested and marched toward and near Rawabi from their settlement called Ateret. Settlers not only used protests to disrupt the Rawabi project, but they also attempted to use the law against the Rawabi. The Rawabi is, in part, able to exist because it can attain some concessions from Israel, and naturally, settler activists seek to weaken and even entirely dismiss these concessions using the law. Regavim, a settler advocacy organization, which asserts that Israel should work to prevent foreign bodies from taking over resources such as Jewish land and natural landscapes, and that claims to advocate for a Jewish and Zionist agenda regarding land use, sued the Israeli government trying to stop and, if not, end Rawabi. They tried to do everything in their power to get Rawabi in trouble by claiming they were dumping dirt in Area C and that this dirt created a strong sense of insecurity among the settlers. Then they argued that Rawabi wasn't being planned well enough and that demolitions were not being enforced. This seems so far as a confirmation of the efficacy of the capitalists' designs for Palestine. After all, these are nice-seeming accomplishments against the occupation, and they do deserve credit for what they have done. Nonetheless, there are a variety of critiques towards Rawabi that in turn deserve attention as well. The usual suspects in critiquing this kind of project would naturally be those of the left. But before we get into that, it must also be mentioned that there are even pro-capital critiques of this project as well. For example, for all the open and free market rhetoric employed by the Rawabi gang, this project is extremely reliant on government aid and foreign aid. A project like this can only be done with the PA negotiating on its behalf with Israel in order to achieve the concessions it needs. This raises the question of why this one firm, Beatty International, is the one being given such special privileges. The way Masri has bent the PA to his whim could also be interpreted not just as a blow to their corruption, but instead Masri folding himself into their corrupt apparatus. The way in which the PA has brought Rawabi into being is also suspect. The Rawabi bylaws mentioned are laws that take advantage of the primordial legal soup of the occupation. Ottoman, British, Jordanian, and Israeli civil administration are all used to govern where buildings are allowed to be built. And as you can imagine, all of this makes no sense. Under the law of occupation, planners are obliged to use Jordanian law in the West Bank. But those sorts of laws legally require the approval of the King of Jordan, who doesn't have jurisdiction in Palestine anymore. Needless to say, it does not make sense, and the PA and Israel basically do whatever they like, wiggling their way through whatever type of law that suits their fancy. The Rawabi planners used a type of expedited planning approval process meant for schools, hospitals, and other public goods to reparcelize land that was not only empty, but which belonged to some of the surrounding villages. But instead of using this process for a public good, it was used for the purpose of private capital. Villagers in Ajul, Atera, and Abwain are of course very displeased that their land, which is in some cases communally owned, was taken for this project. There is an eerie ring to this type of process in that it is similar to that which Israel used to create its settlements to the West Bank. However, this is not the only similarity which the Rawabi shares to Israeli settlements. Moshe Safdie is an Israeli architect who, among other things, designed Modi'in. Modi'in is an Israeli city which was built by taking land from the villages of Ajanjul, Barfiliya, Beit Shana, Bir Ma'in, Al-Burj, Inaba, Khirbat al-Buhayra, Kharuba, and Al-Kunayisa. Safdie, who designed this city, was also consulted in the process of designing Rawabi. Naturally, the Palestinians who have seen their rights taken away from them for the purpose of building Israeli settlements are very upset at the symbolism of having the architecture of their oppressors used. Vocal advocates of BDS, the Boycott, Divestments, and Sanctions movement, are very critical of this type of collaboration with Israel, and they don't see it as advancing the Palestinian cause. Masri has built this project in part by consulting with Israeli stakeholders, and in BDS, this is seen as crossing the picket line. To Masri, however, these complaints are only the product of left-wing living rooms, and that those critiquing him just do not see the glorious vision that he has in store for Palestine. This glorious vision is one where Rawabi is the future of housing in Palestine. Every couple should own their own home or apartment. However, the reality does not meet this vision. 87% of Palestinians live in one home owned by their family. The typical Palestinian household is a large estate housing quite a large extended family, though of course there are renters and workers for housing. The culture of Palestine is thus focused on family-owned homes. Investors want Palestinians to own their own homes, but there is an issue in terms of who will be buying those homes. Their target is the Palestinian middle class, which Patico estimates to be the 34% of the population who make between $600 to $1,000 a month. These people are meant to receive financing, aka mortgage loans. 51% of the population is too poor for this prospect, and the rest are too wealthy to need financing. The goal, therefore, is to get the middle class to buy homes and thus acquire mortgages. There is an issue of supply and manufacturing demand. In terms of supply, only the wealthy 5.2% of Palestinians have their housing needs met. However, if 87% of Palestinians live in these family homes, it raises the question of what can be done to convince enough of them to leave this culture of family-owned homes. The Palestine Investment Fund estimates that there is a latent demand of 146,000 homes. But naturally, these people are biased in that it is their goal to get as many people buying mortgages as possible. Of course, it is ultimately the decision of Palestinians whether they want to undergo this kind of change in their culture and family structure, but nonetheless, there is a push from investors. Masri often complained in the media that the PA would not undertake the building of schools for his project. But in defense of the PA, they are more focused on building up already existing municipalities that exist now and need those resources then and there. This leaves the question as to why it is a project like Rawabi receiving this funding and not something else. In fact, why is the battle for determining Palestinian control of space being waged at a place that isn't even finished yet? Why not somewhere else? If the authorities can pressure Israel in the case of Rawabi, why not in other areas of the occupation?
So, the scenario isn't as optimistic, right? In truth, we have a situation that is very complex, but there are two important things to take away. Number one is that just having the means to create a difference does not in itself create the difference. It remains to be seen if an organized, politically minded Palestinian middle class can emerge, or if an initiative like Rawabi could make things work for the better. But so far, it hasn't benefited most Palestinians. Without the right changes in civil rights matters, this middle class could have money, but not the same opportunities as Israelis, and consequently, not as many things to spend on. Number two is that putting your money where your mouth is as a private citizen can be a good thing, but it also isn't the only or even the most effective way to advance a social cause. Democratic mechanisms, and specifically the power behind democratic mechanisms, is people. The 20th century is full of examples of civil rights movements that achieved seismic social change with widespread support among the disenfranchised. Ultimately, capital is just a resource. An abundance of capital or capital-creating mechanisms isn't enough to bring about a better world. Individuals who can multiply capital won't necessarily have the skills or the incentives to navigate risky political climates, and what is needed is exactly that. A will and an ability to board such a landscape, whether it comes from the organization of the public or the public through the government. As we said, states acquire complexity and rarely shrink, but that doesn't have to be a dead end. If it's hard to toggle the size of institutions, it might be more productive to improve their quality. As it stands, the Israeli economy continues to grow. It is the biggest economy in the Middle East that is not an export-oriented resource sales spot. What this means is that in Israel, you can work and generate profit margins with your own labor. Capital that comes from labor, rather than the strategic control of property, is market liberalism at its best. But the fold is people invested in that security the state provides will have reasons not to challenge it at its core, even some Palestinians. A capitalistic solution in which there is no conflict, which is comfortable for all parties, where things can just be left to the market and where the Israeli and Palestinian polities don't meaningfully settle their differences, is simply impossible. We could say, for example, that Germany's failure to aid democratization in Russia came from such a predicament. Big profits were made without creating political changes. The fact that this fundamentally political issue doesn't have a fundamentally political response yet drops all power in the Israeli state and the Israeli market. And this, dear viewers, is probably the single biggest obstacle to a two-state solution. If the situation gets a standby as it is today, Israel will absorb Palestine. The market will just be a tool of normalization, creating a de facto one-state solution without Palestinian input, which will just feed into the injustice and systemic oppression that currently exists. Because of this, proponents of a two-state solution have every reason to mobilize politically. Even progressives who would like a one-state solution need to work so if the absorption happens, Palestinians can have equal rights in Israel. The market alone won't do this, and a popular, humane international approach to Palestine might be the only way to prevent this continued humanitarian disaster. But even then, the general idea here is that we can't address problems that are inherently political in nature, problems of the rules and agreements in our communities, by throwing money at them and leaving them to the private space. Alright, the voice of the lovely gentleman you heard sandwiched between mine is beacebrocess, a fellow YouTuber who does history and politics videos much like me. Subscribe to him, he creates great content and has been a close friend of mine and of this channel. I would like to thank all of my patrons and of course his patrons for making projects like these possible. And of course, if you would like to help us make more content like this in the future, please consider becoming a patron. You can also join our community Discord servers, which are both available in the description. I would also like to thank Danidu, or Danido, I don't know how to say it, but anyway. She's an Israeli correspondent for Asia Left who helped us proofread this document for sensitivity. You will find her Twitter in the description, and we really appreciate her help because a lot of people who provide criticisms of Israel can sometimes have very ugly ideas that we do not want to give any credence to. As we've said, we are discussing two historically oppressed peoples, so it is important to listen to everyone. I would also like to thank Dylan Burns. He's quite the famous streamer doing very cool things in Ukraine, and he voiced John Maynard Keynes for this video. The video you just watched was largely based around two books, Economics Without Illusions by Joseph Heath, that I looked over, and Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited by Karim Rabi, which Beast looked over. It was also motivated by Ian Shapiro's 18th lecture in his course Power and Politics in Today's World at Yale University, which is available on YouTube. If you're interested in the topic, you can look at any of these to gain a better understanding. I would like to thank the artists who volunteered to help Beast and I put this video together: June001, Limey, Echo, Bamishay, and Paxlark. All of them are content creators of their own and have social media, so if you like what you saw, you can find each of them in the links in the description. Once again, I want to thank AtlasVPN for sponsoring this video. They're our first sponsors here in this channel. And if you're around the 5% of people who made it this far into the video, comment "Thank you AtlasVPN" and I'll give you a heart reaction. And that's that. The next time we see each other in a video essay of this sort, we'll be publishing Quebec 3, so stay ready for that. Peace.